get 1 degree better every day. You know, at 211 degrees, it's still water. At 212, bang, suddenly you're in the next level, and it's a whole different power dynamic. If you're relentless and you just do a little bit more every day, then suddenly, bang, you're in the next level.
So there's no shortcuts, but how long would you say you were doing work that was more grind than glory before you started to penetrate through into, you know, a position of some renown or accolade?
Yeah, wow. That's an interesting question. You know, because one of the coaches in our team, Derek Gaunt, you know, when he tells people he says, get 1 degree better every day. You know, and then that 1 degree, like, when water goes from ice to water, you know, it's been warming up for a while, but then suddenly there's a state change. Or when water turns into steam, you know, at 211 degrees, it's still water. At 212, bang, suddenly you're in the next level, and it's a whole different power dynamic.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think I always grinded it out, but if you're relentless and you just do a little bit more every day, then suddenly, bang, you're in the next level. And and you don't really know when it happens. And I don't think it actually takes that long. You know, I don't think there's that much to get it done, but it doesn't feel like a lot of progress every day. And then maybe 6 months later, you're at a whole new level.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I love the water analogy because, you know, and again, a lot of my audience is, either aspirational entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs in the early launch or growth stage of their business. And which I spent a lot of my time in that stage too. Nobody knew what the heck I was doing. Nobody really seemed to care, except fortunately, eventually a few customers, and then that grew. But you know, you can be 47 degree Fahrenheit water, and then you're 48 degree Fahrenheit water, and you're still cold. And then a while later, you're 80 degree water, and at least you don't feel cold anymore. And then you're once you're about 120 degree water, oh, that's hot. But you're barely even halfway there if you want to power a steam engine. But like you say, you just got to hit that one mark. And I mean, obviously that's a rah moment of encouragement for people out there that haven't reached your level of success. And what I have found, and actually I'd be interested in this dynamic in your career in law enforcement, is that for me as an entrepreneur, every degree I get better exponentially or maybe logarithmically reduces the amount of my competition. Like as 100 degree water, I have a ton of competition. As 101 degree water, I have significantly less. As 150 degree, it seems like I'm almost all alone. And by the time I'm 200, by the time I'm even in the ballpark of turning into steam, I look around and it's like, it seems inevitable at that point because I'm the only one still getting hotter.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what was that like in law enforcement? Was there a certain point where you realized like, hey, I'm pulling ahead of this pack, and even though I'm not there yet, if I just keep the momentum and don't screw it up, I know I've got this in the bag?
Yeah, you know, I think probably early in my FBI days, I'd kind of gone through that on a police department, and you know, I was only a cop for 3 years. And you know, I just worked at it every day, and
that was in New York City?
No, actually, Kansas City, Missouri was where a police officer. Okay. You know, and then, you know, I'd have a good month of stats with just trying to do a good job every night, and then I accumulated, you know, a few good months of stats, and actually, I interviewed for I was still in the PD for the SWAT team. And, you know, the commanders had been paying attention to my stats for a while. You know, and I had no idea. And then suddenly I get commanders that are writing good evaluations for me. And, you know, I don't know. I suppose probably I gained a sense for it after about having been at it for only about 2 or 3 years. And suddenly the guys that I considered my peers from 2 or 3 years ago just weren't getting anywhere at all. And I think at that point in time, I just started to see, you know, the steady accumulation of staying after it. Yeah. And you don't really notice how many of them fall away each and every day. But when you turn back and look down the mountain, there are a lot of them that are a long way behind you.
That's because what do they say? Losers are obsessed with winners. Winners are obsessed with winning. you're not looking back, right?
Yeah.
So it's about that. So it's about the consistency.
Yeah.
Man, you're really drawing the quotes out of my memory bank today. I'm not usually such an annoying quotester, but I can't help but think we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not a virtue, but a habit.
Yeah.
Which is attributed to Aristotle, is actually Will Durant. But man, it seems like you really embody that. So was there ever a situation where you found yourself, or did you ever even allow yourself to ask the question, if I was in this terrorist or kidnapper or whatever the term was, if I was in their shoes, I can understand how they would have reached the point where they would be doing this. And I can't, even though my job is to be their adversary, I can't actually fault them for what they're doing. Did you ever?
Well, you got to understand it. The critical issue is, do you agree with it? And that's a strength in any negotiation. The key to empathy for hostage negotiation and business negotiation. Can I understand where you're coming from and not agree? Or even, can I understand and actually disagree? And so I can understand how, I don't know that, I can't imagine a scenario where I couldn't understand how somebody got to some sort of immoral decision. Understanding the path of how they got there and agreeing is not the same thing, or even holding them accountable. When I went through the training at the negotiation at the FBI, the scenario that they hit us with on a second day was what really started the whole suicide by cop recognition of a phenomena that existed for a long time. It was in Rochester, New York, and a guy named William Griffith went to the bank to be killed by police. And it was when law enforcement had to recognize, if you got a suicide by cop scenario and a guy's got hostages, he's going to kill hostages till we kill him. And that wasn't really, and that's just the way it is. So, we got no choice. He's going to keep killing. And William Griffith, murdered one of the hostages in front of law enforcement because law enforcement didn't want to kill him at the time. So they hit us with that second day of the negotiation training. And so really, I figured that the biggest regret that any other hostage negotiator would go through would be to fail to recognize this. And their failure to recognize it and then make a recommendation to command would cost innocent lives. So my focus as a hostage negotiator has probably contributed to the fact that I'd previously been on a SWAT team, was teaching negotiators from the very beginning. We got a 93% success rate. That means 7% of the time it's gonna go bad. And you're going to have to, and you need to recognize that to minimize the unnecessary loss of life before it does.
So that's one out of every 14 cases. So by your 15th or 20th case, somebody's been killed, either a hostage or a kidnapper.
Yeah, that's what I found. And then I preferred, and you talked about the Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. We had 2 straight cases with those guys. Second case turned into a train wreck where people got killed. And then that's the gut check moment for any hostage negotiator. Because, with the percentages we're talking about, if you do less than 10, everything you touch turns out, and you think, I'm a great negotiator. Everything I touch, people live. I save lives. But by the numbers, once you climb over double digits, you're starting to get into the danger zone where the chances are something's going to go bad. Now, do you quit or do you get better? To quote the great Irish philosopher Colin McGregor, I win or I get better. Which means when you fail miserably, will you rebound or will you quit? Will you get smarter or will you give up? And I think that's also kind of in my nature. Are mistakes learning accelerators, or do they cause you to just quit?
So were there cases where you felt like the lessons learned from a situation where life was lost, you were able to directly apply in the future such that lives were saved and kind of
Without question
rebalance the debt, so to speak?
Without question, what we ended up learning, how we ended up getting better as a result of the Burnhams at Barrel case, not only saved lives on down the line, but it got people out sooner, which was, since most of the hostages are going to live, your real job is to use empathy to shorten the timeline of the deal. There was a company that I gave a keynote speech to fairly recently, and one of their internal sayings was, relationships are the only thing that affect deal timelines. And I thought, yeah, I applied that in hostage negotiation. Empathy is the only thing that's going to affect the deal timeline. Can you apply empathy and accelerate the timeline, or is your lack of it going to lengthen the timeline? And we found that, in hostage negotiation and in turnaround look in real life, business deals, empathy accelerates relationships and it accelerates timelines.
I'm going to let that hang in the air for a second, and I'm going to try to, pump it up a little bit, because I'm going to suggest, at least based on my experience, that's not just true of closing deals, which is kind of a linear, finite business result. I'm going to suggest that I think that's true of growing enterprises as a whole, building businesses as a whole.
Yeah.
If you are empathizing with your customer or desired customer, you are going to accelerate the healthy growth of your business. And if you are fixated on what's in it for you as a business, I think you're going to delay or undermine the success of your business.
I agree completely. Yeah.
That's that word empathy. I love how that word just reverberates through your whole book and through your whole strategy. So the Chris Voss that started at the bottom like everybody else, but was destined to become that pin on top of the pyramid. Where do you think that Chris Voss actually began? When did your story veer into the outlier?
Yeah, well, my father had expectations for everybody, all of his children, to work hard and figure stuff out. And there was a lot of underlying stuff, honesty, integrity. My father was a ridiculously honest guy. And I think I always look to maybe figure it out faster than other people, or consistently get better and get smarter. I mean, there's a saying that I stumbled over not that long ago: never take advice from somebody you wouldn't trade places with. Right. Who do you listen to? And then I look back on a couple of turning points in my career, like when I became an FBI agent. I got referred to a seasoned FBI agent to ask about, what should I do to get ready? And he told me a couple of things that seemed innocuous to me, which I wasn't doing. Like one was, he said, what do you know about current events? And at the time, current events didn't help me become a better cop. The guys that were good cops, I wanted to know what they were studying. So I'm like, I'm not, current events doesn't really help me be a better cop. And he said, well, you come in to interview for us, we're going to want to know you're up to date on current events. So I started paying attention to current events, and lo and behold, the same guy was on my interview panel. If you listen to the right people, they're going to look to see whether or not you paid attention. And I had a ridiculously, almost embarrassingly high score from my initial interview panel. And I think that guy, when he saw that I was coachable, that I listened to him, then it was in his interest to rate me high. Now, the same token, if I'd have come in and they'd asked me about current events and I said, I don't know, it doesn't help me be a cop, so I don't pay attention to it, he probably would have slaughtered me on the panel. And I look back at those moments you mentioned before, the woman that got me on a hostage negotiation team in New York City. She gave me advice and I followed it. And she was shocked that I followed her advice. So, maybe way back when my father was trying to teach me how to work, he was like, look, do it like this, or find out who knows how to do it and ask them. And I think that's really one of the big things. Are you teachable? Are you coachable? Are you willing to be smarter today than you were yesterday? Little things like that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And that anecdote you referred to was, that she gave you the advice to go and I assume the suicide hotline, that's a volunteer thing, right? Like you weren't getting paid for that.
Yeah.
So go
not only volunteer, but on my time too. Like I had to go do it at night when I could have been at home.
Yeah. So that's two instances where you sought out advice, either directly or indirectly. I think with the woman, you didn't. I think you did. You did overtly say, "What do I need to do to get past your gateway?" so to speak.
Yeah.
And ditto for this other guy. So you sought out people in a position of authority who held the keys to, the door you wanted to enter. And you didn't, however it started initially, I don't want to like misstate the anecdote, but essentially you ended up asking them, what do I need to do to be in your favor? And then they answered you, and then you actually did it. And then you went back to them. And at that point, I would posit you had activated 2 of the 6 principles of influence that from one of my favorite books, Robert Cialdini's Influence.
Yeah. I like Cialdini's stuff.
It's so good, right? And now you have reciprocity. They gave to you, and unlike most to whom they give, you did back for them. And I'm not going to say they felt like they owed you, but at least they felt like they owed you some respect. And also liking. We tend to like people that take our advice. It flatters us, right?
Right.
So you had reciprocity and liking on your side in a way that it sounds like, hundreds or thousands of other people didn't in those same situations.
Yeah. Yeah. And, reciprocity and liking from the right people. Like, right. Are they gonna be accountable for your performance? Is your performance actually going to affect them? And if you're either going to be a coworker or they're going to supervise you, then the answer is yes. So, just out of self-preservation, they got an interest in, first of all, giving you good advice, and secondly, seeing that you succeed.
That's a good point. Yeah, if they see you as someone who's already taking and implementing their advice, then it's likely to reflect well on them to promote your advancement.
Yeah.
So imagine that. That sounds like negotiation, right? Aligning with their self-interest.
Yes, very true.
Wonderful. Okay, so as you put it, ridiculously honest dad, which I totally understand, although it's unfortunate that those 2 words ever need to be paired in a sentence in the world we live in.
Right.
But I totally get it. Maybe honest to a fault is another way to say it. And then sought out advice, took the advice, implemented the advice. Sounds like you inherited some work ethic from your dad, I would imagine.
Yeah, both my father and my mother very much believed in hard work. And, the Midwest has not got the market cornered on blue collar ethic. But I grew up in a very blue collar ethic. It's one of the core values of my company. We say blue collar. What does that mean? Work hard, be honest, pitch in. But a very pitch in culture. Like you go to dinner. If you go to dinner at my mom's house, when my mom was still alive, you're expected to help set the table. Pitch in. You don't. She didn't expect you to show up at the front door with a bottle of wine and then be waited on hand and foot. She expected you to show up at the front door, come inside, and help set the table.
Yeah. I had a friend who played in the NFL, and he told me there was a saying that circulated the locker rooms that makes me think of what you're talking about. And it was basically, they would just say to each other, they would go like, "Hey man, the more you can do." And it was short for the more you can do, the more you do. Yeah. And they would just call each other on it if they saw each other loafing on, in practice, on the field, in the locker room, whatever. They just go, "Yo, the more you can do, man." That's what you do.
Yeah. Great reminder. That's leadership too.
Yeah. I love that. So again, at what age would you say you noticed, hey, I'm getting these reviews. I seem to be on a course. Maybe I'm about to make the leap to Quantico and on and on. At what age would you say you've started to sense like I'm on a track to a non-traditional career, like not just another ordinary law enforcement career?
Yeah, I think it started when I applied for the FBI. I was actually pretty young. I was still. They hired me when I was 25, just before my 26th birthday, and I applied earlier that year. I had started to feel good about my ability to achieve goals when I applied for the FBI and the interview process. There's some really solid guys that interviewed me. Like they asked me, like, what what have you, any citations, any letters of recommendation, accomplishments? And I remember saying to him, well, I've gotten a couple of letters from some good things that I've done. And I just got one the other day. And at the same time, I could tell you I've done better work than what these letters, what I've gotten. Some of them are kind of embarrassed because I didn't think I did that great of a job. And I remember those guys saying to me, that's where you're going to find it's going to be in life. You're going to get accolades for stuff that you thought was okay. And there's going to be some stuff you did that you thought was spectacular. And nobody's going to care.
That's so true. Oh, that actually hits. That hits pretty hard. I've got some of my best work, some of my best insight, videos, and or have been some of my more rhetorical, philosophical stuff that I find fascinating. But it's got all of like 27 views online, and then I have other videos that have a couple 100,000 that I feel like were an off day. So yeah, you're right. It's strange that way. But so the reason I asked that question about the timing is you're in your mid-20s, so you didn't have to differentiate yourself for like decades and decades to start to get momentum. I mean, it took when did you join law enforcement?
I was 23 years old. I just got out of college, and back in those days, college degrees for people that wanted to be cops was rare enough that they gave me a slight extra point or two in the evaluation process for having a college degree. And so I rolled right into it. I'm sure there's a lot more college graduates going into local law enforcement these days than back then, but it was pretty rare. So it was an advantage.
Yeah. I can tell you, I mean, I'm in education, so I have all the college data. 54% of all people in the country who have a college diploma are either unemployed or they're working a job that doesn't require a college degree. So there are a lot of unnecessary college degrees. And in that sense, I suspect, even if law enforcement doesn't require a college degree, I suspect there are a lot more college degrees in law enforcement because there's just a surplus of college degrees these days that weren't even necessary. But don't get me going on that rant. That's my education rant. Yeah. My education reform rant. But the reason I asked that, so again, 3 years, it basically took you 3 years of showing up consistently, doing the right things, asking the right questions to start to differentiate yourself. And I think that's so significant for anyone listening to hear. It doesn't take that long to do exemplary work and be recognized and build momentum from doing exemplary work. Because I know so many people, especially in the world we live in right now, post-pandemic, so many people are faced with having to make some sort of a pivot in their life. We have 40 million jobs were lost in this country in the last 18 months. And a huge number of them aren't coming back because the CEOs and the big corporations invested in artificial intelligence and automation because they realize, hey, we need to be able to do work even when there's a pandemic and everybody is told to stay home. And so you have tens of millions of people right now that are faced with some kind of a pivot. And I think there is a counterproductive and defeating narrative in the world that says, I don't have time to make a change. But the reality is you go into anything new and within a couple years of doing good work, you can have virtually outshined almost all your competition.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. And I would say that if you hammer away for 3 years, you can completely reinvent and accelerate past everybody else.
Yeah. Actually, I wasn't even I didn't know your answer was going to be 3 years, but I'll mention that 3 years ago, I had not even shot my very first video talking about education. And now I have the largest online education company in the world for entrepreneurs in less than 3 years of just going hard. I made my content and I proclaim my message the way Chris Voss worked his law enforcement career. You just get it done. You grind every day. You ask the more you can do or what your term was for it. I don't remember, but and it's just incredible how fast it can happen. That's if my show can accomplish anything in this world, it's for people just, I know not everybody listens. This is close to the 200th episode of my show. I'm under no illusions that most people are going to listen to all 200 episodes. So I want to make sure that any one episode that somebody happens to catch, they can catch the message that can change their life. And I think among several we might uncover, this is one right now, that it doesn't matter what you have to pivot into. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how you get started. If you will be excellent for just a few years, you will stand above the crowd faster than you probably think, especially when you're in the thick of it and it feels like thankless toil.
Yeah. I would agree.
So anyways, okay. So that's how, I feel like I've done my service of like trying to dig into Chris's, outlier origins. And I appreciate you going biographical with me. I know my audience is going to be super frustrated with me if we don't get into some of the war stories, so to speak.
Sure.
And the strategy beneath it. And obviously you have an extraordinary book. Like I said, I've listened to over half of it. I honestly can't wait. If I wasn't at this health retreat that I'm at right now, I'd be done with it. Like, I can't wait to get to the end of it. There's amazing stories in there. Talking about what was the guy, Abu Sayyaf, the Philippines guy.
Yeah, again, the Philippines.
The guys that robbed the bank in Manhattan, or I guess it was two guys. No, I won't give it away. It was somewhere between 2 and 12 guys.
Right.
But no spoilers. But anyway, so yeah, I'm curious, when did you, maybe here's a question. So you start to get this success and you start to create these opportunities for yourself. When did it cross over into true, like life or death? Like, it's no longer about Chris looking good. It's about someone else staying alive. What was that first instance? Hey, sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to let you know you can get a free copy of my book, The Millionaire Shortcut, which shows you the fastest way to become a millionaire in the new economy. And there's a special link just for this episode in the description. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode.
Yeah, it was probably at that Chase Manhattan Bank robbery. Chase Manhattan Bank in Brooklyn. And I had, it had been that long since I've been trained as a hostage negotiator. And it actually hadn't, the suicide hotline experience, which I was still volunteering on the hotline at that time to keep my skills sharp. Because negotiation is a perishable skill. Jim Camp wrote a book called Start With No. Jim used to say negotiation was a human performance event. And, Jim had been a football coach, among other things, and that's why he described it like that. But I'd studied, I kind of been prepping, like you come out of the negotiation training at Quantico, and you want to get out there and you want to get in the middle of something big. And the crazy thing, after every class, somebody in the class falls into something inside of a week. Not everybody does. So
yeah.
when I got to the Chase Manhattan Bank, I mean, that was a real full-fledged bank robbery with hostages, which is really rare. But I was ready, I'd been working my process. I'd been practicing. I'd had all my small stakes practice. So when they handed me that phone, I was the second guy up to bat that day. I just, I knew that there were hostages inside that could die. But I just leaned into the process and I didn't feel the pressure.
Do you think that let's call it not feeling the pressure, or maybe it's the hunger for battle, even real battle with real bullets? Do you think that that's something that they can fully train into a person, or do you think there's a part of you that was just born ready for a high stakes engagement and able to handle it?
Yeah. Daniel Cole wrote a book called The Talent Code that says nobody's born with anything. Mm-hmm. Now, what happens along the lines that get you ready for it? Like, I know, I had read in sports analogies in sports and law enforcement that the top performers in sports actually envisioned the scenario before it happened in order to perform. I think I've heard this referred to as visioning. So the first thing that I accepted that I had to envision was, if you're going to actually utilize deadly force, you've got to visualize what it actually takes for there to be a human being in your sights versus a paper target. Mm-hmm. And then I'd seen people fail in shooting situations where they should shoot. And one of them was a classmate of mine. And this person said to me, I just never thought I'd ever actually have to use my gun. And I remember saying, what did you think we were doing on the target range? And a lot of people just say, I'm just punching holes in a target. I'm never going to have to shoot at a person.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody might die if you don't embrace that. So I'd already gone through that. By the time I was a hostage negotiator, I knew that I had to have thought about the consequences in order to reconcile yourself to it. And I think that had a lot to do with it.
Have you, I'm curious, have you ever read a book or heard of a book called On Killing?
I've heard of it. It's, if you mention the author's name to me, I've heard him speak. Interesting cat.
Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to look it up real quick. It's been a long time, by Dave Grossman.
Dave Grossman. Yeah. Yeah. I attended some conferences he spoke at.
And it's been a long time since I read that book, but it was extraordinarily fascinating about how, and actually this is a good insight, not only on your side, but also on the flip side of the people that are so, I guess at least some of the people you engage with, Abu Sayyaf, for example, they're ready to kill. They have no compunction. But On Killing talks about the natural human resistance in the majority, the fat part of the bell curve, the vast majority of human population. We do not like to kill people. We especially don't like to kill our fellow countrymen, anybody that talks like us, looks like us, or could reasonably be, from our world. We do not like to kill. And they've excavated or, I guess archaeologically sort of explored like Civil War battlefield sites. And, in the Civil War, they would line up in lines. Maybe stop me if you've heard Dave Grossman talk about this, but they would line up in lines and they would march toward each other. And it was pretty reasonable. If you have two lines of people that are 300 yards apart, then if you want to hit the person, there's a certain angle that you point your musket to account for the arc of the bullet, and you're going to hit the other line. And every person in the line can calibrate off of everyone else and figure out what angle do we need to point our muskets in order to kill the other guys, right? Because everybody's the same distance away. And when they excavate these battlefields, they find the vast majority of fatalities were from bayonets, because people were intentionally either undershooting or overshooting the other line. Because it wasn't until they got so close that it was truly kill or be killed in an instant with a spear that they could actually even bring themselves to shoot the other guy or to kill the other guy. Like they'd find bullets like a quarter mile back in the woods, and like, why was anybody, like hundreds of them, like, why are people shooting back there? And it's because they were thinking about the Civil War. You had families fighting each other. You had people from Virginia fighting people from Maryland, or just across the state line. They didn't want to kill each other.
Right.
So I'm curious. So when you went through training, and then the book talks about the work they did in like the Vietnam War and how they figured out how to get soldiers more comfortable with killing soldiers. What was there any training that you went through that you feel like was critical to actually get you to get you over that emotional resistance to deadly force if it came down to it?
Well, first of all, it was the acceptance of it to begin with. Different epiphany moments. When I was a police officer, I remember walking down the street one day, and I was in plain clothes. I was off duty, and a police car went by. And, I saw a couple of people on the street. I saw one guy act like he was pointing a gun at the police officers and say, I'd like to kill every one of them. And I remember thinking at that point in time, there are people that don't even know me that would kill me just because of what I was doing for a living. And, different places along the lines. And then I read that article about performance under extremely stressful situations. And then probably one of the critical training was when I went through SWAT training. If you're going to embrace the training, they put you in all the different scenarios where not only is it a legally justifiable killing, it's morally justifiable. And those are not always the same thing. It can often be legally justifiable and not be, it might not be morally acceptable. But they wanted us to envision what it was like to go through each one of those. And they caught me off guard a couple of times. A scenario where it might be legally and morally called for. And I hadn't envisioned that. So I think me being open to the training and being honest about it every step of the way, and then I picked it up at different points in time.
Yeah, it's such a, I have a friend who's a Navy SEAL too. And, I've talked to him about this fair amount. It's just, I find it extraordinarily interesting tragically beautiful in a way, what some human souls are forced to go through so that the rest of us can be safe and do our casual day-to-day whatever without worrying about, lawlessness. I just find it's such an extraordinary level of human development that you guys get to. I think I could talk about it endlessly, and I appreciate it so much. So I'm curious, when do you feel? God, I have so many questions. This is a really hard interview for me because I just have so many questions. When was the time, maybe to the extent you can share, when you were the most morally, and perhaps in another way, if it's more interesting to talk about, conflicted or challenged in what you were having to do in your job?
I don't know that I was ever really conflicted over it, just because, I believe that law enforcement is necessary, and I believe that law enforcement's use of deadly force is necessary, and that it should be treated with a tremendous amount of respect. And then, for my own sort of spiritual beliefs, like the universe might put me in a position where it was necessary for me to make this decision.
Yeah.
Now, I never had to actually make that decision. While I was in law enforcement, I had the opportunity to produce my firearm, but never had to pull the trigger. So I don't know its impact on me had I made the decision. Mm-hmm. And I'm grateful that I never did. Had to come to grips with that.
So, question I have to ask, like I said, I have to make peace that there's going to be at least 10 questions I don't get to ask, and I'm fine with that. But here's one I'm not going to not ask. Based on your experience with what many would say are some of just the craziest people in the world, right? These people that do these ridiculously dangerous things, ruthless things, things that are not likely to succeed statistically. How many of these people on a percentage basis would you say are, let's call them sanely sociopathic, meaning given their set of circumstances and the fact that they are calibrated a certain way emotionally or psychologically, they're actually doing what you could realistically predict them to do or reasonably predict them to do, versus they're just actually completely batshit crazy, like mental illness is running the gamut. So I'm curious your percentages, I'm curious your diagnostic approach, and I'm curious the distinction in strategy based on the diagnosis.
Yeah, well, actual mental illness, they're really so non-functioning that they're not going to be able to pull together any kind of a scenario where they're taking hostages.
Okay.
Somebody who's actually paranoid, schizophrenic, taking a hostage is a really rare event. I mean, just like rare. And, they give us some training in it, so we recognize it in advance because they're utterly unpredictable. What they found in law enforcement a couple of times was every now and somebody that had no history of schizophrenia would suddenly become unpredictable, unreadable. And then they found the commonalities with them with their former meth addicts. Mm. And if somebody suddenly, for no reason, when the negotiators thought they had rapport, they thought they had a calm person on the other side, out of the blue committed a homicide with a hostage, if they went back and did sort of a forensic psychological excavation, they found a significant occurrence of previously being addicted to meth in the past.
Meth in particular, not all drugs.
Not all drugs. The only one that I ever heard in my professional community that people repeated was we found out that they had been meth addicts. They thought they were clean, but what meth did to people's brains was just enough significant damage to their wiring, for lack of a better term, that it almost would create a sort of schizophrenia in them.
Wow. I mean, you see that on Intervention, but it's different told through the stories you tell. Let that be a warning out there, folks. Like, don't try drugs, but if you're gonna, don't try meth. You don't want residual mental illness.
There are certain drugs that are out there that I could say, yeah, it probably doesn't need to be illegal, and there's some support to decriminalization of certain drugs. but meth is not on that list.
Well, so, okay. So then in that case, would it suggest that there tends to be a basic personality type of a hostage taker? Or are there multiple personalities that are not insane, but let's say sane in different ways?
Yeah, there was, and they've always tried to nail that down. One of the problems with psychology as a science is it's a soft science, and they've continually changed the definitions. Like, what was bipolar this year was manic depressive last year, and we have a tendency now these days. We found out in hostage negotiation, we actually followed a lot more neuroscience rules. And as we apply this in the Black Swan method, neuroscience is common to you if you're human. That's kind of all it takes for it to be effective. And so we really look at neuroscience and neurochemicals a lot more than we look at psychology. In psychology, before neuroscience, the discussion was, as a hostage taker, are they a borderline personality? Are they manic depressive? And nobody could ever really nail it down because there wasn't a lot of hard science, and psychology changes their definitions every few years.
It depends which edition of the DSM you look at, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now you got me with this neuroscience thing. And I know we only have 10 minutes, but I love neuroscience. I mentioned I'm at a health retreat right now, literally working on my own neuroscience. So are you saying, how does that apply to a negotiation? Are you saying that you're actually measuring or calculating for what's going on neurochemically in a moment in a negotiation, and even trying to influence that through a tactic?
Yeah. Actually, we're definitely, we look at negotiation as managing a series of emotional moments. And, there's a book that I read recently called The Molecule of More, which is about dopamine. Dopamine, which is a great motivator of human behavior, is about the future. And oxytocin, which is the bonding drug, is about the present.
Right.
And I'm looking for certain responses. Empathy triggers oxytocin.
Yeah.
And if we bond, or more importantly, if you bond to me, then now I've got influence. And that's really what I'm going after, because if you're bonded to me, you might listen to me, which means I get influence.
So let me ask you a question. I just, maybe I'm showing my I don't know, my dark side here, trying to strategize through this. But okay, so if I'm a kidnapper and I know that you want to bond with me, you want to forge empathy, that's limbic resonance, right? That's, my hippocampus, amygdala, hypothalamus, thalamus structure resonating with yours, right? And that happens through voice or through eye contact. So if I'm a kidnapper and I've got Chris Voss on the other end of the line, I'm trying to text with you or email.
Yeah, and the funny thing is they don't study it. They don't know. I mean,
so you never had somebody be like, I'm not talking to you on the phone, text me, or I'm not talking to you.
No.
Let's hope that the bad guys of the world never see this interview.
And it's crazy. I mean, because, that level of work and understanding, I mean, even, the funny thing is the Black Swan method was originally designed to deal with really aggressive, assertive negotiators that are trying to take you for everything you got, kidnappers. Mm-hmm. And that is just really close to the profile of procurement and contracts negotiators in every big company. Now, they'll study our techniques. The procurement negotiators, they work really hard at getting better. And these techniques still work on them.
So it's not about the sophistication. I mean, or this is a question. Is it not about the sophistication of the technique, but rather it's about the discipline and the repetition in consistently applying it at the right time?
Probably is discipline and repetition. Yeah, I'd go along with that.
What you referenced the Black Swan method. Obviously, that's the name of your company. Black Swan. The Black Swans in general negotiation practice, you define as kind of these hidden tells or these hidden desires that, if revealed, will fundamentally alter the dynamic of the negotiation. Did I get close enough?
Yeah, very good.
What is per se the Black Swan method insofar as you can sum it up, without giving away all your IP? But I mean, when you say the Black Swan method, how would you kind of reference that?
It's applied emotional intelligence. It's taken what we learned about empathy and hostage negotiation, and it's adding in what neuroscience has told us is true about people. Like, neuroscience has told us that the amygdala, which is kind of the crossroads or the command post of the limbic system, the amygdala is 75% negative. And right. So then through neurological experiments, they've told us how best to disable the negative parts of the amygdala when they're functioning. So if we know that to be the case, then let's go after diffusing the negatives before we try to reinforce the positives. It accelerates the outcome.
And when you say negatives in reference to the amygdala, I mean, the amygdala is really your fear and survival center, right?
Right.
So when you say negative, you mean productive of a fear response rather than productive of a safety response.
Right, exactly. Well, the safety is, it'd be hard to draw the fine line, but in any given negotiation, you're probably going to think that I might be asking for a lot. Or you're probably asking yourself why you're talking to me in the first place. That's probably true of enough negotiations that if at the very beginning of the negotiation, if I say, look, you're probably asking yourself why you're talking to me in the first place. Inside, you're going to be like, yeah, wow, I wonder what you're going to say next.
So it's those that's right statements you talk about.
Yep. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you haven't read the book, they say, if you get them to say that's right, that's a score.
You are on the right track.
That's an empathic connection, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, here's a question. Then let's call this our last in the interest of time. So in sales, whether it's spoken word sales or copywriting, which I work in the realm of copywriting a lot as an internet guy, does a lot of marketing online. We talk a lot about stoking the fear or agitating the pain point. And you want your sales process to be like you're talking about, reducing fear, increasing empathetic connection and creating feelings of safety and abundance and certainty if they decide to move forward. But in your method, you're entering into a situation where the fear is already ratcheted up at about as high as it can go on both sides. In sales, a lot of times you have to start by not necessarily, I was going to say artificially, but at least intentionally increasing fear so that you can then present your option as a way to reduce the fear. Does your approach, knowing that you know how to stimulate the amygdala in one direction, I presume you know how to stimulate it in the other, and do you teach that as part of sales or business training?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you got to get to a position of trust. And, I don't know that we're actually stoking fear or we're making people aware of threats that are there and helping them understand that with some really small choices, they can have a massive impact on our future. So,
that makes sense.
But we definitely, if the negative parts of the amygdala are deactivated and the positive takes over, which is kind of where trust-based influence has been established. I mean, that's enormously powerful. And I think it's so powerful that people sometimes forget that the negatives had to be deactivated first. They just notice how powerful a positive approach could be. And they just completely ignored the sequence of how quick, the best way to get there, the fastest way.
Like I said, I have every answer you give me just produces like 5 more questions. So this is one of the hardest things I've had to say on an interview in a long time, Chris, which is, gosh darn it, we're about out of time.
I would love to tell people how they can follow up if they want any more information.
Yeah, that's my next question, of course, is for those who want professional contact or just to be in your world and absorb your content, please share all options.
Yeah, the absolute easiest and best way is to subscribe to the newsletter. It's short, concise, it's free, it's complimentary. In my view, the value is not that it's free, the value is that it's concise. It's one actionable article on Tuesday mornings emailed to you. It's also the gateway to everything the Black Swan Group has. If you find something you want to read, it'll take you to our website, and we get a massive amount of free resources to help you build your base. BlackSwanLTD.com is the website, but the newsletter subscription, best is you can go to the website and sign up, or you can text to sign up. Black Swan method, 3 words, not cap sensitive, spaces between each word, as a message sent to the number 33777, and that's 33777.
Okay.
Black Swan method.
Yeah, and for your knowledge, we will make sure that we put both of those calls to action in the description and show notes wherever this appears.
Thank you.
And then what about your book? Is your book available on your website, or should they just go, wherever they buy books?
You're going to get the best price on Amazon. It's I buy it on Amazon. That's and that's the best place to buy it.
As someone who's just got his own book deal, I'm going to tell you what that tells me. The fact that Chris buys his own book on Amazon means he's a legitimate bestseller. He's not someone that did a buyback clause in his publishing deal to go buy a bunch of copies of his own book to drive up the sales figures. So congrats on that, Chris.
Thank you.
Man, thank you so much. Are you on social media?
At the FBI Negotiator on Instagram.
The FBI Negotiator. Chris, thank you so much for being a guest on Millionaire Secrets, man. This has been one of my favorite interviews to date. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff. I really enjoyed it.
If you love entrepreneurship, then you'll want to keep watching. So click the next interview right here for some more Millionaire Secrets gold. Thanks for watching.
When I got to Pueblo, first thing I did was take my $100. I went to the bank and I went to zero 5 minutes after I was there. I was no longer managing money, and it forced me to go make contacts with people.